The desert stretched endlessly before Thomas Keller, a tapestry of rust-colored earth and scattered sage that seemed to mock his empty belly and lighter pockets. His horse, a weathered mare named Dust, picked her way carefully between the rocky outcroppings, her ribs showing through a coat dulled by weeks of poor feed. The sun hung merciless overhead, a white-hot coin in the bleached sky, and sweat carved clean lines through the dirt on Thomas's face. He'd been riding for 3 days since leaving Tucson, with nothing but the clothes on his back, $2 silver, and a reputation that preceded him like a storm cloud. The gambling debts he'd left behind weren't the kind that forgave or forgot, and the men who held his markers weren't known for their patience. Better to face the desert's honest cruelty than the calculated malice of creditors with guns. Thomas pulled his hat lower, the brim casting precious shadow across his weathered features. At 32, he looked older, lines carved by sun and disappointment radiating from eyes the color of winter sky. His father's pocket watch, the last thing of value he owned, pressed against his chest with each of Dust's weary steps. He'd sworn not to pawn it, but hunger had a way of reshaping a man's principles. The landscape ahead promised little comfort. Mesquite and Palo Verde trees dotted the terrain like scattered thoughts, offering meager shade to the lizards and roadrunners that called this wasteland home. In the distance, the Dragoon Mountains rose like broken teeth against the horizon, their peaks promising cooler air but demanding strength he wasn't certain he possessed. A coyote's distant cry echoed across the flats, and Dust's ears swiveled nervously. Thomas patted her neck, feeling the salt crystals that had formed where sweat had dried. They'd need water soon, both of them. The last creek had been a day behind them, a muddy trickle that barely qualified as moisture. His canteen held perhaps 2 swallows, if he was generous in his estimation. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon when Thomas spotted the thin column of smoke rising from behind a cluster of granite boulders. His first instinct was caution. Smoke meant people, and people meant the possibility of trouble he couldn't afford. But smoke also meant fire, and fire meant warmth and perhaps food. His stomach cramped at the thought of a hot meal, reminding him that he hadn't eaten anything substantial since yesterday's meager breakfast of hardtack and bitter coffee. He guided Dust toward the smoke, his hand instinctively checking the weight of the Colt at his hip. The gun held 5 bullets. He'd counted them that morning, as he did every morning, like a miser counting coins. Enough for protection, not enough for a sustained fight. He'd learned long ago that survival often came down to knowing when to draw and when to ride away. As he rounded the boulder formation, Thomas found himself looking down into a natural basin where someone had made camp. A small fire burned steadily, fed by carefully gathered mesquite branches that produced minimal smoke. Beside it sat a figure wrapped in a colorful blanket, hunched over what appeared to be a small cooking pot. The smell that reached him made his mouth water involuntarily, something savory with herbs he couldn't identify. But it was the figure's stillness that caught his attention. Even from this distance, he could see the labored rise and fall of breathing, the way the blanket trembled despite the desert heat. Whoever it was, they were ill. Thomas dismounted slowly, his boots crunching on the gravelly slope. The figure didn't look up, didn't acknowledge his presence with anything more than a slight tightening of the blanket around thin shoulders. As he drew closer, he could see that it was a woman, Apache, by the look of her clothing, and the careful way her long black hair was braided with small shells and beads. She was young, perhaps 25, with the kind of bone-deep beauty that transcended the fever that currently claimed her. Her skin, normally copper-toned, had taken on an unhealthy pallor, and her breathing came in short, shallow gasps. When she finally looked up at him, her eyes held the glassy brightness of high fever, but also a wariness that spoke of hard-learned caution. "You are lost," she said in accented but clear English, her voice barely above a whisper. Thomas removed his hat, an old habit his mother had drilled into him before consumption took her when he was 12. "No more than you, I'd guess." He gestured toward her obvious illness. "You don't look well." A bitter smile crossed her lips. "Broken Horse knows this. She waits." "Waits for what?" "For death or healing. Both require patience." Thomas looked around the small camp, noting the careful organization despite her condition. A water gourd sat within reach, along with a small collection of plants and roots he didn't recognize. The pot over the fire contained what looked like a thin soup, steam carrying the promise of nourishment. "When did you last eat?" he asked. She considered the question as if it required great effort. "Yesterday. Perhaps the day before." Time moves strangely when the spirit fights to stay. Thomas tied Dust's reins to a sturdy mesquite branch and approached the fire slowly, keeping his hands visible. Apache or not, sick or not, this woman had survived alone in country that killed stronger men. That demanded respect. "I have little to offer," he said, settling onto his heels near the fire. "But I could tend the flame while you rest. Looks like your soup might burn otherwise." Broken Horse studied him with those fever-bright eyes, and he sensed a mind still sharp despite her body's weakness. After a long moment, she nodded toward the pot. "The medicine plants make it bitter, but it keeps the soul tethered to the body." Thomas ladled some of the soup into a small bowl, she indicated, the liquid thin but fragrant with unfamiliar herbs. He offered it to her, but she shook her head weakly. "You have the look of hunger," she said. "Eat first. The soup knows no difference between Apache belly and white man belly." He wanted to argue, but the generosity in her words, spoken despite her obvious need, shamed him into acceptance. He sipped carefully, surprised by the complex flavor, bitter herbs balanced by something that might have been wild onion and rabbit. It was unlike anything he'd tasted, but it warmed him from the inside and seemed to ease the constant ache in his stomach. "This is good," he said, and meant it. "My grandmother's recipe. She said it could heal anything but a broken heart and a guilty conscience." Broken Horse's smile held a hint of mischief despite her weakness. "You carry both, I think." Thomas paused with the bowl halfway to his lips. "What makes you say that?" "Your eyes. They look backward more than forward, and your hands shake, but not from hunger." She was right, and they both knew it. The gambling, the debts, the endless string of poor decisions that had led him to this moment, they all pressed against his chest like a stone. He'd been running from more than creditors when he left Tucson. "Your turn," he said, filling another bowl and offering it to her. This time she accepted, her hands trembling as she brought it to her lips. She managed only a few sips before exhaustion claimed her, and Thomas gently took the bowl back. As the sun touched the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and deep purple, Thomas fed the fire and watched over the Apache woman who had shown him kindness when she had every reason to fear him. Stories reached even broke cowboys about what happened to lone women who trusted the wrong men, Apache or otherwise. Broken Horse drifted in and out of fevered sleep, sometimes murmuring in her native language, sometimes calling out names Thomas didn't recognize. During her lucid moments, she told him fragments of her story, how she'd left her people to seek medicine plants for her sick sister, how the fever had taken her 3 days into the journey, how she'd been too proud to turn back. "Pride," she whispered as the first stars appeared. "It rides many horses, but always leads to the same place." Thomas understood. His own pride had kept him at poker tables when wisdom said to walk away, had made him take loans he couldn't repay, had convinced him that the next hand would be the one to turn his luck around. Pride was a luxury he could no longer afford. He shared his meager supplies with her. Hardtack softened in the medicinal soup, water from his nearly empty canteen. In return, she taught him which plants to look for in the morning, how to read the signs that might lead them to water, how to build a fire that would burn long with minimal fuel. As the night deepened and the desert cold crept in, Thomas found himself talking more than he had in months. Perhaps it was the isolation, or the strange intimacy of sharing soup with someone who might not survive till morning. but words spilled from him like water from a broken dam. He told her about his father, a schoolteacher who died believing his son would make something of himself. About the war that had taken his older brother and left Thomas to carry expectations he'd never been strong enough to bear. About the woman in Kansas City who'd married a banker while Thomas chased rumors of silver strikes and easy money. "You run from shadows," Broken Horse observed, her voice stronger after the soup and rest. "But shadows follow everywhere. Better to face them. Easy to say when you're not the one wearing them. Every person wears shadows. Apache, white man, Mexican, all the same. The difference is who chooses to dance with them." Before Thomas could respond, Dust nickered nervously and stamped her feet. He looked up to see the horse's ears swiveled toward the eastern rim of the basin, her body tense with alertness. In the distance, barely audible over the fire's crackling, came the sound of approaching horses. Broken Horse struggled to sit upright, her face suddenly alert despite the fever. "They come," she whispered, and there was something in her voice, fear mixed with resignation. "Who comes?" "My people, led by Strong Bear, my father's brother." She pulled the blanket tighter around herself. "He thinks to marry me to his son, to join our horses and cattle. I came here to avoid choosing." Thomas felt his stomach drop. An Apache war party finding him alone with one of their women was the kind of situation that ended with scalping and worse. He moved instinctively toward his rifle, but Broken Horse caught his arm with surprising strength. "No weapons," she said urgently. "Strong Bear is proud but fair. He will listen before he acts. But if you show steel, he will answer with steel." The sound of horses grew closer, and Thomas could make out individual hoofbeats now, at least 6 riders, maybe more. His mouth went dry as dust, but he forced himself to remain seated by the fire, his hands visible and empty. "What do I say?" "Truth," Broken Horse replied simply. "It is the only thing that might save us both." The first rider appeared at the rim of the basin just as dawn light began to creep across the eastern sky. He was a large man, broad-shouldered and straight-backed, despite what Thomas guessed to be 50 years of desert life. His face was painted for war, red and black stripes that made his dark eyes seem to burn in the growing light. Behind him came 5 other warriors, all armed with rifles and the kind of grim expressions that suggested they'd ridden hard and expected trouble. Their horses were painted for battle, and every man carried enough weapons to outfit a small army. Strong Bear's gaze swept the camp, taking in every detail: Thomas's position by the fire, Broken Horse's obvious illness, the shared meal, the careful distance between them. When his eyes finally settled on Thomas, they held the weight of judgment. "White man," he said in English that carried the authority of absolute command, "why do you sit at my niece's fire?" Thomas stood slowly, keeping his movements deliberate and non-threatening. Every instinct screamed at him to run, to fight, to do anything but stand there under the scrutiny of 6 Apache warriors who could end his life before he drew breath to scream. "I shared soup with a sick woman," he said, his voice steadier than he felt. Nothing more. Strong Bear dismounted in a single fluid motion, and the other warriors spread out around the basin's rim, cutting off any hope of escape. He approached the fire with the careful gait of a man who'd survived by reading danger in every shadow. "Broken Horse left her people without permission," Strong Bear said, his eyes never leaving Thomas's face. "She avoided the marriage ceremony prepared for her and my son, 2 hawks. This brings shame to both our families." Thomas felt sweat beading on his forehead despite the morning cold. "I know nothing of marriage ceremonies. I found her sick and shared my fire." "Your fire?" Strong Bear's voice carried a dangerous edge. "You claim ownership of Apache land?" "No," Thomas said quickly. "Her fire. I shared her fire. And her soup." Broken Horse struggled to her feet, the blanket falling from her shoulders to reveal the full extent of her illness. Her legs shook with the effort, and she would have fallen if Thomas hadn't instinctively reached out to steady her. The warriors tensed, and Thomas froze, realizing how his movement must look to men already primed for violence. But Strong Bear held up a hand, and his warriors remained motionless. "Uncle," Broken Horse said, her voice carrying across the basin with surprising strength. "This man asks nothing from me. He gives food when he has little, tends fire when he could ride away. He is no threat to our family's honor." Strong Bear studied them both for a long moment. "Yet he touches you, to keep me from falling, as any decent person would do." Decent. Strong Bear seemed to taste the word, as if weighing its meaning. "What makes you think this white man is decent, Broken Horse?" "What makes you think any of them are decent?" The question hung in the air like smoke, carrying generations of broken treaties, stolen land, and casual violence. Thomas understood that he wasn't just being judged for his actions in this camp, but for the sins of every white man who'd ever cheated or killed or lied to the Apache. "I don't know what makes any man decent," Thomas heard himself say. "Apache, white or otherwise. But I know what I've done, and what I haven't done. I found her sick, I shared food, and I asked for nothing in return. Judge me for my actions, not my color." Strong Bear's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes, a recognition, perhaps, or the beginning of respect. "You speak plainly. This is unusual for white men in my experience. I got no reason to lie. If you mean to kill me, words won't stop you. If you don't, lies won't help me." One of the younger warriors said something in Apache, his voice urgent and angry. Strong Bear responded in the same language, his tone sharp with authority. The young man fell silent, but his hand remained near his rifle. "Two Hawk says you have stolen what belongs to him," Strong Bear explained. "He says any white man found with Apache woman should die." Thomas looked at the young warrior, seeing the fury and jealousy burning in his eyes. Two Hawks was perhaps 25, with the lean build of a natural fighter and the arrogance of someone who'd never learned to lose gracefully. "I've stolen nothing," Thomas said. "You can ask her." "I ask you." Strong Bear replied, "Do you claim my niece as your woman?" The question was a trap, and they all knew it. Say yes, and he'd be claiming rights he had no right to claim. Say no, and he might be abandoning Broken Horse to a marriage she clearly didn't want. Thomas looked at the Apache woman, seeing the fever still burning in her eyes, but also something else, a quiet dignity that reminded him of his mother in her final days. She'd faced death with that same steady courage, that same refusal to be broken by circumstances beyond her control. "I claim nothing," he said finally. "She's her own woman, with her own mind and her own choices. That's not for me to say or you to decide." The words landed like stones in still water, sending ripples of tension through the assembled warriors. Two Hawks said something sharp in Apache, his hand moving to his knife, but Strong Bear's voice cut through the morning air like a whip crack. "Enough." The chief approached Broken Horse, his stern expression softening as he took in her obvious illness. When he spoke to her, it was in Apache, his voice gentle despite the harsh consonants of his native language. She responded in kind, her words coming in short bursts between labored breaths. The conversation continued for several minutes, with Thomas standing motionless under the watchful eyes of 5 armed warriors. He couldn't understand the words, but he could read the emotions, concern, frustration, and something that might have been fear in Strong Bear's voice, defiance mixed with weakness in Broken Horse's responses. Finally, Strong Bear turned back to Thomas. "My niece says you gave her food when she was hungry and tended her fire when she was sick. She says you asked for nothing and took nothing. That's true. She also says the fever may take her before the sun reaches its peak, that she came here to seek medicine plants, but found only sickness." Thomas felt something cold settle in his stomach. In the shared intimacy of the night by the fire, he'd allowed himself to hope that rest and food might restore her strength. But looking at her now in the growing daylight, he could see the signs he'd missed in the darkness. the waxy pallor of her skin, the way her hands trembled even when she wasn't moving, the hollow look around her eyes that spoke of a body consuming itself. "The plants she gathered," Thomas said. "The soup she made. Maybe that will help." Strong Bear shook his head slowly. "The medicine plants were for her sister, who died 3 days ago while Broken Horse wandered in the desert. She has been feeding herself poison, thinking it was healing." The words hit Thomas like a physical blow. All night he'd been drinking soup that was killing the woman who'd shared it with him. All night she'd known she was dying and had still chosen to feed him first, to share what little she had with a stranger who could offer nothing in return. Why? The word came out as barely a whisper. Broken Horse answered for herself, switching to English with obvious effort. "Because kindness is not made smaller by sharing, because a person should not die alone if there is choice." Strong Bear studied his niece's face for a long moment, then turned to Two Hawks and spoke rapidly in Apache. The young warrior's face darkened with anger, but he nodded reluctantly and stepped back. "I release my niece from the marriage promise," Strong Bear announced. "Two Hawks will find another wife, one who chooses him freely." Two Hawks said something that sounded like a curse, wheeled his horse around and rode hard from the basin. The other warriors remained, but their postures had relaxed slightly, hands moving away from weapons. "You," Strong Bear said to Thomas. "What is your name?" "Thomas Keller." "Thomas Keller. My niece will die before another sun sets. This is not poison that can be purged or sickness that can be sweated out. The spirits have already begun calling her home." Thomas looked at Broken Horse, seeing the truth of it in her eyes. She'd known all along, had probably known when she first offered him the soup. She'd been preparing for death and had chosen to face it with generosity rather than bitterness. "What do you want from me?" Thomas asked. "Nothing, but I offer you something. My niece says you are a man without home, without family, without direction. She says you run from shadows, but do not know where you run to." "That's about right." Strong Bear nodded. "Then stay. Sit with her while she finishes her journey. Show her the same kindness you showed last night. When she is gone, you may go in peace with our blessing and protection." The offer was more than generous. It was miraculous. Thomas would have expected torture and death for being found with an Apache woman. Instead, he was being invited to witness what these people clearly considered a sacred passage. "Why?" he asked. "Because she asks it. Because you shared soup when you had little to share. Because sometimes the spirits work through strangers to teach us what we need to learn." Thomas looked around at the assembled warriors, seeing acceptance where he'd expected hostility. Whatever Broken Horse had said to her uncle, it had transformed him from enemy to, if not friend, then at least neutral party in their shared humanity. "I'll stay," he said. The day that followed was unlike anything Thomas had experienced. Strong Bear's warriors made camp around the basin, but they kept their distance, allowing Thomas and Broken Horse the privacy for her final hours. The Apache chief himself disappeared for a time and returned with fresh water and plants that might ease her pain if not her passing. As the morning wore into afternoon, Broken Horse drifted between sleep and wakefulness, sometimes speaking in English, sometimes in Apache. During her lucid moments, she told Thomas about her childhood, about learning to ride before she could walk properly, about the stories her grandmother had told around winter fires. "Do you fear it?" Thomas asked as the sun reached its zenith. "Dying, I mean." She considered the question seriously, as she seemed to consider everything. "I fear pain. I fear leaving things unfinished. But death itself." She shook her head slightly. "My grandmother said death is like crossing a river. You cannot see the other side from where you stand, but you trust that it is there. And if it isn't, then the crossing itself is the thing that matters. How you face the water, whether you help others cross, whether you bring grace or fear to the current." Thomas had never thought of death in such terms. In his experience, death was an ending, a failure, a thing to be avoided at all costs. But listening to Broken Horse speak of it as a journey rather than a destination, he began to understand something he'd never grasped before. "You're not afraid," he said, and it wasn't a question. "I am terrified," she replied with a weak smile. "But fear does not change what must be. Better to be terrified with dignity than to be terrified and small." As the afternoon shadows began to lengthen, Broken Horse's breathing became more labored, and her periods of sleep grew longer. Thomas sat beside her, occasionally offering water or adjusting her blanket, but mostly just being present in the way she'd asked him to be. Strong Bear approached as the sun touched the western mountains, his painted face solemn in the fading light. "She is crossing now," he said quietly. "You have done well, Thomas Keller. My niece chose her companion for this journey wisely." Thomas looked down at Broken Horse's face, seeing the peaceful expression that had replaced the fever's agitation. Her breathing was so shallow now as to be almost imperceptible, but her eyes were open and clear. "Thomas," she whispered, and he leaned closer to hear. "The soup, it was not just medicine plants." "What do you mean?" "Some healing, some poison. I knew when I offered it to you. I wanted to see what choice you would make." Understanding hit him like cold water. She'd been testing him from the beginning, offering him soup that might harm him to see if he would take it from a sick woman. If he would demand she eat first, if he would show the kind of selfishness that marked so many of the men she'd encountered. "You could have died," he said. "I was dying anyway. Better to die knowing something good about the world than knowing only the bad." Her hand found his, her fingers surprisingly warm despite her failing strength. "Take my grandmother's recipe. Share it with someone who needs kindness. Let the good things multiply instead of the bitter ones." As the sun disappeared behind the mountains and the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Broken Horse closed her eyes for the final time. Her breathing slowed, stopped, then slowed again, until finally the rhythm simply ceased, like a song finding its natural end. Thomas sat in the growing darkness, holding the hand of a woman he'd known for less than a day, but who had taught him more about courage and generosity than he'd learned in 32 years of living. Around him, he could hear the Apache warriors beginning their death chant, voices rising and falling like wind through canyon walls. Strong Bear placed a gentle hand on Thomas's shoulder. "She is across the river now. You helped her cross with dignity." Thomas stood slowly, his joints stiff from sitting motionless for hours. "What happens now?" "Now we prepare her for the final journey. You are welcome to stay for the ceremony, or you may go with our protection. The choice is yours." Thomas looked around at the assembled warriors, men who had every historical reason to hate him, but who had shown him nothing but respect because of one woman's final request. He thought about his empty pockets, his gambling debts, his aimless wandering across a landscape that had seemed to offer nothing but hardship. "I'd like to stay," he said, "if you'll have me. Then stay. Help us build the fire that will light her way home." They worked through the night, gathering wood and stones, preparing Broken Horse's body with careful ritual, sharing stories about her life and her family. Thomas contributed what he could, mostly just labor and respectful silence, but he felt welcomed into something larger than himself, a community bound not by blood or nationality but by shared recognition of human dignity. As dawn broke over the desert, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, they lit the funeral pyre. Smoke rose straight up in the still air, carrying with it the prayers and memories of a woman who had chosen kindness over bitterness, courage over fear, generosity over self-preservation. Thomas watched until the last ember died, then gathered his few belongings and prepared to mount dust. Strong Bear approached as he was checking the saddle. "Where will you go now?" the chief asked. Thomas considered the question, realizing for the first time in years that he actually had a choice. His debts seemed less important now, his failures less defining. Broken Horse had shown him that how a person faced adversity mattered more than whether they succeeded in avoiding it. South, I think. Maybe find some people who need help, who could use an extra hand. Strong Bear nodded approvingly. Good choice. The path of service is harder than the path of self-interest, but it leads to better country. He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a small leather pouch. My niece would have wanted you to have this. Medicine plants, the healing kind, not the poison, for when you find someone who needs what she gave you. Thomas accepted the pouch, feeling its weight in his palm like a promise. Thank you. Thank yourself, Thomas Keller. You could have ridden past her fire. You could have taken food without offering comfort. You could have shown her the face of cruelty that she expected from white men. Instead, you showed her kindness. That gift travels both ways. As Thomas rode south from the basin, the sun climbing toward its daily appointment with the desert sky, he carried with him more than just medicine plants and good wishes. He carried the memory of a woman who had transformed her own dying into an act of grace, who had used her final hours to teach a stranger about the difference between existing and living. The desert stretched ahead of him, vast and challenging as ever, but it no longer seemed empty. Somewhere ahead, he knew, were people who needed help, communities that could use his hands and his newfound understanding of what really mattered. The road would still be hard, but he would travel it differently now, not as a man running from his past, but as someone moving toward a future he could help create. Behind him, the smoke from Broken Horse's funeral fire continued to rise, carrying her story into the eternal sky. Ahead, the horizon promised new stories, new chances to choose kindness over convenience, courage over comfort. Thomas touched the medicine pouch in his saddlebag and urged Dust forward into the day, ready to discover what kind of man he might become when he stopped running from his shadows and started walking toward the light. The desert wind carried the scent of sage and possibility, and for the first time in years, Thomas Keller felt truly alive.